When all is darkness and every way out is lined with blood and lit with the fires of battle, there is still hope.
The Soul Drinkers were a renegade chapter of Space Marines declared excommunicate traitores by the Inquisition because of their extremely high levels of mutation and obvious corruption by chaos. Yet the Soul Drinkers still considered themselves to be loyal to the Emperor of Mankind, if not to his Imperium. The Soul Drinkers originally believed themselves to be a second founding successor chapter of the Imperial Fist's Legion, only for the chapter's Astartes to later learn to their shock after an analysis of their gene seed by the apothecaries of the Angel Sanguine that they were actually of unknown genetic origin and founding. The Soul Drinkers were ultimately destroyed as a chapter in the 41st millennium when they worked with the Imperial Fists to end a chaos plot initiated by one of their own number, the venerable dreadnought Denyathos, to seize control of the Imperial Fist's mobile fortress monastery, the Phalanx, and spread the power of chaos across the galaxy. After the chapter was destroyed, the Imperial Fists honored its Astartes' final sacrifice in the defense of mankind. Despite the extinction of the chapter, their name, colors, and heraldry were reinstated on the order of Robout Guilliman in the Era Indomitus, and thus all of their number are now Primaris Space Marines originally created in the Ultima Founding. When the War Master Horus was slain and his rebellion broken, the remaining loyalist Space Marine legions were broken up into chapters, so no man would have power over so many Space Marines at any one time. Rogel Dorn knew the pride his gene sons took in the glory of the Imperial Fists and fought to have his legion left intact. But he bowed to his fellow Primarchs, and his Space Marines became a multitude of chapters, one retaining the name of the Imperial Fists, the others taking on new names and heraldry, ready to forge new paths into Imperial history. Thus, a new tier of Adeptus Astartes were created in 021, M31, and this event came to be known as the Second Founding. As such, the first warriors to form the ranks of the new chapters were the very same Space Marines who had fought at the side of their Primarch before and during the tumultuous Horus heresy. To each of his successor chapters was given a symbol of their sacred purpose, gifted by Dorn himself, so they would remember that his spirit was with them always, that his glory was theirs also. The Soul Drinkers, believed to have been formed in the Second Founding from the former personal guard of the Imperial Fists, First Captain Sigismund, himself the first High Marshal of the Black Templars, and from the remaining fleet-based shock attack elements of the Viaith Legion, received the Soul Spear, a relic vortex weapon. Dorn himself had found it on a dark and lonely world during the Great Crusade, and with it he had speared great warp beasts, and from it had hung his banner on 100 worlds reconquered in the Emperor's name. He supposedly granted it to the Soul Drinkers as a symbol of purpose and as a sign that, despite being split into separate chapters, all of the Imperial Fist's successors were still united in spirit and brotherhood. One of these Soul Drinkers' most famous campaigns occurred during the Wars of Apostasy, also known as the Terran Crusade, which was a series of battles and military campaigns fought against the forces of the renegade High Lord of Terra Goge Vandire during the Age of Apostasy's reign of blood in the 4th century of the 36th millennium by the Emperor of Mankind's loyalists. In 378, M36, the Black Templars' High Marshal Sigonandus, declared an imperial crusade against Vandir on Terra. The Black Templars, together with their parent chapter the Imperial Fists, the Soul Drinkers, the zealous Firehawks, and elements of the Martian Tech Guard, took the fight to Terra itself and laid siege to Vandire's ecclesiarchal palace. The crusade ended with the death of Vandire at the hands of one of his former bodyguards, Alicia Dominica, the founder and future patron imperial saint of the Adepta Sororitas. The Soul Drinkers also had many notable victories on other worlds against Xenos races, such as the Ildari during this era.
Soul drinkers, I need not tell you why you are here, or what is expected of you, or how you will fight. These are things you will never doubt. But know now that when the youngest novices, or the most scared of veterans, ask you how you spent your time serving this chapter, it will be enough to tell them that you were there the day your chapter proved it never forgets a matter of honor. The day the soul spear was returned.
The soul drinkers were declared excommunicate traitores by the Inquisition after their obsessive need to retrieve the relic known as the Soul Spear, which had been lost for 1,000 Terran years, since the soul drinkers' flagship sanctifier had been lost on a warp jump. It had finally been found residing in the collection of a degenerate who had no comprehension of its true significance. The soul drinkers vowed to bring it back to their chapter's embrace. This eventually brought them into conflict with the Adeptus Mechanicus. The forces of the Mechanicus were ostensibly assisting the Adeptus Ministorum, but in actuality wanted to obtain the Soul Spear for themselves, so that they might examine and possibly reverse engineer its ancient technology. The standoff between the Soul Drinkers and the other Imperial forces ended with the destruction of the Mechanicus star Fort Lakonia, and major damage to several starships of the Adeptus Ministorum and Adeptus Mechanicus. The remaining Soul Drinkers retreated in their strike cruiser to an asteroid field where they were beset by the combined fleets of the Inquisition and the Adeptus Ministorum until the Soul Drinkers' fleet, led by Chapter Master Gorgolian, arrived by Warp Route 931C that had been closed for 600 standard years prior to this incident. After the Soul Drinkers chapter fleet linked up with the survivors of the Soul Drinkers' assault on the Star Fort, Chapter Master Gorgolian told his fellow Soul Drinker Captain Sarpedon of an offer the Inquisition had made, which required the deaths of the Space Marines involved in the Lakonia incident in exchange for a reprieve. Gorgolian explained that he had refused this offer on the basis that the only person fit to judge a Soul Drinker was another Soul Drinker. This judgment would require Sarpedon to face Gorgolian himself in a ritual duel to the death known as the Shield Rites to determine the righteousness of Sarpedon's actions on Lakonia. During the height of the duel, Sarpedon seemed to be affected by some outside power and spontaneously grew 8 arachnoid legs, giving him a crucial advantage over Gorgolian and enabling him to tear his erstwhile commander to pieces, and so claim the mantle of Chapter Master for himself. Although he did not know it at the time, his mutation was caused by the corrupting powers and influence of the chaos god Tzeentch, who intended to make the Soul Drinkers yet another one of his countless pawns in Chaos's long war against the Imperium. After a brief but bloody struggle with those who could not accept his mutation, and those who still believed that Sarpedon was uncorrupted, Sarpedon became the new leader of the Soul Drinkers chapter from that point on. Despite their rejection by and of the Imperium of Man itself as an utterly corrupt institution, the Soul Drinkers remained steadfastly loyal to the Emperor of Mankind, even after they had been exposed to the raw power of chaos. This exposure subsequently began to manifest mutations in the chapter's other Space Marines. After a time, the chapter Apothecary Palace managed to stop the spread of new mutations, and also to halt the progression of mutation in those Astartes already afflicted, thanks to the retrieval of information held on the planetoid Stratix Luminae. This information came at the price of the Soul Drinkers being forced to abandon Sergeant Tellos and his cadre of assault marines as they made their escape from the planetoid, though Tellos and his squad turned to the service of chaos completely to save themselves. The Soul Drinkers next came into conflict with the Crimson Fist's force commander Rhaenys, and with Slaanesh worshipping Drukhari in an attempt to bring the now chaos-aligned Sergeant Tellos to justice. After a long battle between chaos forces and the forces of the Imperium, Sarpedon fought Tellos in a duel. Sarpedon emerged victorious, and believing Tellos dead, withdrew the Soul Drinkers from the combat. Tellos survived, only to be killed when the Inquisition bombed the world where Tellos and his war band had taken up residence. The Soul Drinkers next had to face enemies from within and without as a promising scout marine, Brother Eumenes, usurped the chapter's leadership from Sarpedon. Meanwhile, the Howling Griffins chapter had vowed to destroy the ambiguous chaos force known as the Black Chalice, which they believed to be the Soul Drinkers chapter. In the end, Sarpedon killed Eumenes, declaring him unworthy of being chapter master. He then addressed the remaining Soul Drinkers, Battle Brothers, asking if any of them wished to take up the burden of the office of chapter master. When none of them responded, Sarpedon declared he would remain the chapter master. Not satisfied with this, at least one squad of the newer Soul Drinkers recruits left the chapter.
When all is darkness and every way out is lined with blood and lit with the fires of battle, there is still hope.
While fleeing from an Adeptus Mechanicus task force, the Soul Drinker's Space Hulk was severely damaged and found itself low on fuel. Forced to run from the Mechanicus forces, the Soul Drinkers went deep into the veiled regions of the galaxy in search of fuel. They discovered the Necrons active on many worlds in this region of space, all with signs of previous human settlement, but now infested with the undying ancient Xenos. Eventually, they came upon the last of the human worlds that the Necrons were still in the process of cleansing of all life, and the Soul Drinkers made a deal with the survivors. They allowed the humans time to retreat to their spacecraft, while the Soul Drinkers held the Necron forces off in exchange for the Soul Drinkers receiving fuel. The Soul Drinkers held out against the Necrons, and the escaping human population reached their spaceport as agreed, but a Necron fleet arrived in-system, preventing them from leaving. The Adeptus Mechanicus fleet arrived shortly after, and the two fleets began fighting each other. It became obvious that the Imperial forces would soon be destroyed by the more potent Necron fleet, so they began a complex pattern of maneuvers intended to delay the inevitable. When the Soul Drinkers realized they could not beat the approaching Necron force on the ground, while the Mechanicus fleet would lose in space, Sarpedon offered an alliance to the Mechanicus. Chaplain Ictinos of the Soul Drinkers and his flock of space marines remained behind to help defend the spaceport and the surviving humans. It is revealed that Ictinos, and through him his flock, is loyal to another master, and not the Emperor of mankind, although the identity of this master was never clear. Accepting the proposed alliance from the renegade space marines, the Mechanicus and the Soul Drinkers set off for the main Necron crown world, Salayaka, planning to destroy the Necron Lord and leave the rest of the enemy forces in the region leaderless. Arriving at the Necron's tomb world, the Mechanicus crashed their starship into Salaka and deployed their forces alongside the Soul Drinkers. A long, bloody battle ensued as the unlikely allies sought to kill the Necron Lord before the Necron's superior numbers overwhelmed them. Finally, the Imperials arrived at the Necron Lord's headquarters, and Sarpedon dueled and defeated the undying creature. However, in typical Necron fashion, the Necron Lord soon resurrected itself and began crushing Sarpedon to death. Only through the sacrifice of Tech Marine Liggies was the Necron Lord finally defeated. Gathering his forces, Sarpedon led his remaining warriors towards the crashed Adeptus Mechanicus starship, where their promised transports off-world were to be awaiting them. Instead, they discovered 3 Imperial Fists Thunderhawk gunships deployed upon the surface of Salaka, while 20 Imperial Fists of the elite First Company in Terminator armor teleported onto the planet, led by First Captain Darnath Lysander. Lysander ordered the Soul Drinkers to surrender to Imperial justice or be destroyed. Sarpedon replied by invoking the right to challenge Lysander to a personal duel. Despite Sarpedon's warp-enhanced strength, he had been badly depleted in the earlier fighting and was swiftly defeated by Lysander in single combat. Sarpedon had ordered the Soul Drinkers to surrender if he was beaten by Lysander in the duel, and thus prevent the chapter from being wiped out by the Imperial Fists. The captured Soul Drinkers were brought aboard the ancient and massive starship Phalanx, the mobile fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists chapter. The Imperial Fist intended to prosecute their brother chapter for their apostasy. Though most heretics would never have been granted such an honor, as former scions of Rogel Dorn, the Soul Drinkers would have their day in court, for the Imperial Fists were a chapter of honor. To the Imperial Fists, a trial was more than a mere formality. It was their intention to see every correct procedure and tradition adhered to, so that no one could dare say that they did not give the Soul Drinkers every chance to redeem themselves. The Fists had collected evidence of the Soul Drinkers' deeds, including many that had pitted them against the forces of the Imperium from which the Soul Drinkers had rebelled. When the Soul Drinkers were first brought on board, the Imperial Fists recovered a copy of the Soul Drinkers' so-called Catechism Martial. They acquired this tome from one of the members of Chaplain Ictinos' flock upon the confiscation of his power armor, forcing him to give up the book along with the secrets it contained. These members of Ictinos' flock were the Soul Drinkers whose officers had died in the gradual erosion of the chapter's strength, and who had turned to Chaplain Ictinos for leadership. The treacheries and revelations revealed within the pages of the Catechism Martial made the Imperial Fists take an interest in interrogating Ictinos' Astartes themselves. During the interrogation of Brother Kayan by the Imperial Fists Lord Castellan Lucrantas, the Soul Drinkers revealed the chapter's secrets to him. It was discovered that Deniathos, the legendary philosopher-soldier and author of the Catechism Martial, still lived, despite evidence that he had died over 6 Terran millennia before. Deniathos had been interred within the adamantium sarcophagus of a mighty dreadnought and hidden within a secret tomb on the world of Salaka. This tomb was built with a series of ingenious traps put into place, ensuring that none save an Astartes would have the skill to discover the secrets contained within. When Deniathos' crypt was discovered by a lone Imperial Fists scout marine, the resurrected Soul Drinker came willingly and let himself be brought aboard the Phalanx to face his fate alongside his fellow battle brothers. A conclave of Space Marines was formed to listen to the presented evidence and to pass judgment on the Renegade chapter. This conclave was composed of various Imperial Fist successor chapters, including representatives from the Crimson Fists, Howling Griffins, and the Iron Knights, as well as other chapters with no connection to the Imperial Fists, such as the Doom Eagles, Silver Skulls, and the Angel Sanguine. There was also a representative from the Inquisition, as well as a small contingent of battle sisters of the Adepta Sororitas and tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Brother Rhinez, the former captain of the Crimson Fist's Second Company, who had been dishonored by the Soul Drinkers on Intimian IV after he lost his company standard to them in combat on that world, was appointed as the Soul Drinkers' prosecutor. Rhinez had given up his rank and petitioned his chapter master to walk the path of the warrior's pilgrimage, one who wandered the galaxy seeking redemption outside his chapter by looking for an enemy worthy of killing him, so that he could seek redemption in death for his failings. When Rhinez heard that the Soul Drinkers had been captured and were to be tried on the Phalanx, he made haste for the Imperial Fist's vessel and presented himself before their chapter master, Vladimir Pugh, and petitioned for the right to prosecute the Soul Drinkers so as to regain his honor. The loyal servants of the Imperium had gathered to listen to evidence presented against the Soul Drinkers, while Vladimir Pugh presided as the Justice Lord of the court. During the trial, evidence was presented by both sides that both defended the Soul Drinkers' actions as well as damned them. Multiple revelations were revealed during the course of the trial, including the fact that Deniathos still lived within the body of a dreadnought that had been hidden within a tomb on Salaka's surface. Sarpedon had not been aware of this tomb's existence or that there were any surviving dreadnoughts from his chapter, as the last one had been believed to have been destroyed 6 millennia earlier. Serving as prosecutor, Rhaenys condemned the Soul Drinkers, implicitly implying that they had been corrupt for millennia while under the guidance of Denyathos. He charged that they had long been sworn to the service of the ruinous powers and had intended to carry out some plot at the Dark God's behest intended to damage the Imperium. During Rhaenys' presentation of the evidence against the chapter, Sarpedon finally realized that Chaplain Iktinos had been manipulating the Soul Drinkers chapter along the path of damnation in order to fulfill some unknown destiny foreseen long before by Denyathos. Next, Commander Gethsemar of the Angels Sanguine chapter called into question the validity of the Soul Drinkers' claims of being the genetic sons of the Primarch Rogel Dorn. The Angels Sanguine had captured a Soul Drinkers Space Marine and extracted his gene seed for medical study to determine whether or not their heresy was a result of corrupted genetics. In the course of the investigation, they were startled to learn that the Soul Drinkers' genetic legacy could not be traced back to the Imperial Fists and Rogel Dorn. During the course of the trial, pilgrims of the Order of the Blinded Eye conspired to help the Soul Drinkers escape their bondage. They had been manipulated by the intricate machinations of Denyathos to help him achieve his mysterious objectives. Not questioning their newfound freedom, the surviving Soul Drinkers made their last stand within the Phalanx Librarium. The forces of the Imperial Fists and their successor chapter brethren converged on the Soul Drinkers' position, and a vicious firefight ensued. The breakout of the Soul Drinkers from their holding cells was merely a distraction, as Denyathos used this diversion to carry out the final phase of his meticulous plan. His most loyal follower, Chaplain Iktinos, kidnapped Captain Enkalo of the Iron Knights and brought him to his master. Using the blood of the battered Astartes, the genetic code of Rogel Dorn was the key to unlock an infamous warp gate known as the Predator's Eye that was actually hidden within the Imperial Fist's fortress monastery. Unable to destroy it outright, the Primarch Rogel Dorn had sealed this warp gate nearly 10 millennia before, and had vowed that one day, when the countless other threats had subsided, he and his chapter's librarians and other champions would finally destroy the Predator's Eye. The warp gate had originally been located in the Kravamesh system within the Veiled region. Denyathos had stolen it and hidden it within the confines of the Phalanx itself millennia before during the assault on Terra to topple the renegade High Lord of Terra Gog Von Dire at the end of the Age of Apostasy in the early 36th millennium. From the newly opened warp gate emerged the various foul denizens of the Immaterium, including the master architect of the Soul Drinkers' fate, a demon prince of Tzinch named Abraxas. Denyathos intended to use Abraxas' power to travel the galaxy, with the Phalanx as his personal chariot, spreading the power of chaos throughout the Emperor's realm. Now Abraxas would be able to use the warp gate as a doorway into the Empyrean from which would spill the legions of demons under his command. Denyathos wanted to fundamentally transform the Imperium, freeing its people from the shackles of oppression and fear and installing himself as the new master of all mankind. Abraxas was merely a tool to be manipulated like everything else in the galaxy. In the meantime, Sarpedon had escaped from his captors and reunited with his remaining battle brothers. Leaving them behind to face a glorious death in the Imperial Fist's librarium, Sarpedon sought out the whereabouts of Denyathos, but was waylaid by Iktinos' flock. The small squadron of Soul Drinkers that were with Sarpedon were killed in the carefully executed ambush. Enraged, Sarpedon slew all of Iktinos' followers and then sought to confront the renegade chaplain himself. As the remaining Soul Drinkers valiantly defended themselves within the ruins of the Phalanx Librarium, they knew that it was only a matter of time before they were wiped out through attrition. At the height of the vicious battle, the encroaching forces of the Imperial Fist and their allies unexpectedly withdrew their forces. Sensing that something was awry, The Soul Drinker's Captain Luco led the remainder of his battle brothers out of the Librarium. Monitoring the Imperial Fist's Vox traffic, they soon discovered that Abraxas was leading a massive demonic force that was assailing the Imperial Fists from within their own fortress monastery. They bravely presented themselves before the Imperial Fist's chapter master Vladimir Pugh and begged of him to be given the chance to fight and die by their side against a common enemy that threatened them all. Reluctantly, the Imperial Fists agreed to the Soul Drinker's request to face the demons, as they understood that this was in itself a death sentence. In the meantime, Sarpedon discovered Ictinos and confronted him in a vicious hand-to-hand battle. Sarpedon was gravely wounded, but not before he managed to subdue the wayward chaplain. Using his innate psychic ability known as the Hell, Sarpedon brutally wrested the information from Ictinos' mind concerning Denyathos' true intentions and learned to his dismay what Denyathos had planned across the long millennia and how he had been but an unwitting pawn in that ancient game. His task completed, Sarpedon took the mortally wounded chaplain, whose mind had been utterly shattered by his psychic assault, and launched him out of an airlock into the void of space. He then made his way towards the main bridge of the Phalanx to confront Denyathos. Denyathos confirmed Sarpedon's suspicions of what his grand scheme for the galaxy would entail. Denyathos believed that the Imperium was utterly corrupt and that its people were damned. 6 millennia earlier, Denyathos had learned that the Imperium was a dark and savage place, a breeding ground for the desperation that gave the forces of chaos the chance to do their wickedness in the material universe. It was through suffering that the Imperium would be remade, great suffering, on a scale beyond the imagining of lesser minds. Thanks to the plan crafted by him and executed by so many others he had manipulated across the bounds of space and time, including the Soul Drinkers, Sarpedon, and Abraxas, the Phalanx would spread such suffering in its wake that the Imperium would be remade stronger and more just, with Denyathos as the new ruler of the galaxy. Sarpedon bravely confronted the corrupt dreadnought in combat, attempting to stop Denyathos' mad ambitions from coming to fruition. During the combat that ensued, Sarpedon sustained multiple mortal wounds from the dreadnought's missiles and stormbolter. The dreadnought smugly plucked the mortally wounded chapter master from the floor with his power fist, intent on crushing Sarpedon to death. The dreadnought brought the chapter master closer, so he could get a better view as he brought his victim's life to an end. Sarpedon suddenly enacted a desperate plan, reaching into an ammunition pouch that hung from his belt from which he pulled the soul spear. He had reclaimed this ancient archaeotech weapon from Ictinos during their confrontation in the Phalanx hangar. Using the artifact's deadly vortex field-encased twin blades, Sarpedon whipped the soul spear upwards through the heart of Denyathos' cybernetic sarcophagus, separating it from the body of the dreadnought. The pressure on Sarpedon relented as the dreadnought's power fist fell inactive. Sarpedon freed himself from the power fist and stood before what remained of the dreadnought's body. The front of the walker had been completely sheared away, revealing the life support cradle in which Denyathos had spent the last 6,000 years. Reaching inside, Sarpedon tore away the cabling and wiring and grasped Denyathos around what remained of his scrawny neck, pulling him out of the sarcophagus. Sarpedon had a fate in mind that befitted the treachery enacted by Denyathos. Meanwhile, Captain Luco and Sergeant Gravis of the Soul Drinkers, along with a small squad of Imperial Fists, Librarian Varnica of the Silver Skulls and a battle sister of the Sororitas, made their way towards the Predator's Eye in order to close the warp gate and confront Abraxas himself. Along the way, they were waylaid by the demonic horrors of the warp, and many of their number were slain. In a final confrontation, the surviving Astartes and Sister Ascarion managed to overcome the savage demon prince and cast him back through the warp gate. The Predator's Eye slowly sealed itself shut. At the height of the pitched battle between the beleaguered Imperial forces and the massive demonic host, the sudden closing of the warp gate dramatically affected the demonic army. The daemons dropped to their knees or began to scream in pain as their link with Abraxas and the Immaterium itself was broken. The Imperial forces quickly took advantage and charged into the ranks of the bewildered demonic horde, cutting them down where they stood. The Imperial defenders drove the demons forward, through the phalanx forges and on towards the cargo bays, where the heart of the demonic infestation had been planted. Librarian Varnica, Sister Ascarion, and 2 soul drinkers were the only survivors of the great battle to seal the warp gate. When First Captain Lysander arrived to take custody of the soul drinkers, the soul drinkers' captain hauled the gravely wounded Gravis over towards the closing portal. The 2 soul drinkers knew there was no place left in the galaxy for them, not in the cells of the phalanx, or in the grip of whatever punishment was decided for them, not even in freedom. The whole galaxy had been set against them for so long that there was nowhere they could go and nothing they could do. They would not hand themselves over to the Imperial Fist's custody. The 2 surviving soul drinkers stepped through the portal into the warp and into whatever fate awaited them there. The portal then closed completely, cutting off the madness of the Immaterium from real space. As the Imperial Fists and Howling Griffins were killing off the last of the demons running loose on the vessel, Sarpedon made his presence known. The chapter master was near death, wounded, but not defeated. Sarpedon then held up the atrophied remains of Dynyathos before Chapter Master Pugh and the Imperial Fists, and explained that it was he who had brought Abraxas forth from the warp. Dynyathos had been the architect of the Soul Drinkers' damnation, manipulating the Soul Drinkers' chapter into the destiny he had foreseen. Sarpedon explained that it was because of men like Dynyathos that innocents suffered, and that he had been a fool for not seeing that Dynyathos had manipulated him into the role he wanted him to play. He challenged the Imperial Fist to succeed where he had not and to help stem the suffering of mankind, or else do nothing and watch the human race fall. Though moved by his words, Chapter Master Pugh still had to take Sarpedon into his custody, but the Soul Drinkers' Chapter Master refused. Instead, Sarpedon somehow managed to reopen the warp gate. As Sarpedon stepped towards the portal, Dynyathos grew fearful of his fate within the realm of chaos and screamed in terror, for the dark gods were unkind to those of their servants who failed. Sarpedon stepped over the threshold and into the portal, dragging the screaming philosopher soldier into the warp and out of reality. The portal then slammed shut behind them. Despite everything that had passed between them, the Imperial Fists recognized the sacrifice of the Soul Drinkers and had their names chiseled on vast stone columns within their apothecarium. One column bore the names of the Imperial Fists who had died in the valiant defense of the phalanx, whilst alongside it another column bore the names of the Soul Drinkers, listing them as brothers in death. The Soul Drinkers. Chapter was no more, but not their legacy, for their tale would serve as a caution to all those who do not see that the hand of chaos is ever present and ever ready to lead humanity to its unwitting damnation. In the era Indomitus, the extinct Soul Drinkers were refounded by order of the resurrected Primarch Roboute Guilliman himself. The chapter was re-established with Primaris Space Marine recruits raised during the Ultima founding, and was able to take part in the Indomitus Crusade. The Soul Drinkers scored a much-needed victory during the campaign known as the Keprian Reclamation. The Soul Drinkers loosely followed the Codex Astartes, but were similar to the Blood Angels in that their preferred tactics were shock assaults. Interestingly, within the Soul Drinkers chapter, novices did not serve as scouts in the field. Instead, they earned their understanding of war through attending on their more senior brothers and learning from them the example of what it meant to be an Astartes. They penned chansons of their senior brothers' deeds on simple data slates, recording their achievements and victories as a permanent record for the chapter's archives, preserving it for future novices to study. The Soul Drinkers suffered heavy losses at several points after they went renegade. After their first chapter war and the battle on Vaymeth's planet, they numbered approximately 700 Astartes. After the fighting on Stratix Luminae, they were reduced to approximately 450 Space Marines. Though they were able to increase their numbers by being able to recruit neophytes again, their numbers were reduced to 300 Astartes after the losses on the world of Endymion before and the Second Chapter War. The exodus of most of Eumenes' traders at the end of that conflict dropped the number of Soul Drinkers to 250 Astartes. By the time they struck down the Necrons within the Veiled regions, there were scarcely 100 Soul Drinkers left, all having been captured by the Imperial Fists and taken aboard the Phalanx. When the treachery of the dreadnought Denyathos was finally revealed, and the Phalanx suffered an incursion of a massive demonic host, the majority of the Soul Drinkers died in the valiant defense of the Phalanx. In the end, Denyathos' plans were thwarted, and the demon prince Abraxas was defeated. The last known remaining firstborn survivors of the original Soul Drinkers chapter are the philosopher-soldier Denyathos, Chapter Master Sarpedon, Captain Luco, and Sergeant Gravis. These Soul Drinkers stepped through a warp gate and into the immaterium and out of reality. Their fate remains unknown. In the era Indomitus, after the chapter was refounded using only Primaris Space Marines, it was reorganized along the lines outlined in Robert Guilliman's revised Codex Astartes. The Soul Drinkers chapter was once believed to have originally been raised from those Space Marines in the Imperial Fist Legion who specialized in ship-to-ship actions and high-speed insertion assault. Hence, the chapter's combat doctrine was formed around this specialty, emphasizing quick, highly coordinated assaults upon any perceived weak points in the enemy defense line. The combat philosophy of the Soul Drinkers was based in large part around the Catechism's Martial, a treatise on battle written by the warrior Denyathos. Every Soul Drinker carried a copy of the tome with them. The Soul Drinkers preferred to use shock assault tactics against the enemy. They favored the use of boarding actions and drop pod assaults so that they could use their mobility and heavy firepower to overwhelm the foe quickly and not get bogged down into an extended firefight or slugging match, always staying very mobile and, if necessary, whittling the opposition down through attrition during repeated lightning strikes. The revelation that the Soul Drinkers were not a successor chapter of the Imperial Fists has altered the perception of why this chapter pursued this combat doctrine, but not that they were true experts in the arts of mobile assault and void combat. There is some doubt as to the origin of the Soul Drinkers' gene seed. During the Soul Drinkers' trial aboard the Phalanx, Commander Gethsemar of the Angel Sanguine presented evidence that his chapter's sanguinary priest had thoroughly examined the gene seed of the Soul Drinkers chapter. They performed this medical examination as part of their research into the link between the gene seed and their supposed Primarch, and also to determine if the Soul Drinkers' fall was due to some form of unforeseen corruption of their genetic material. Much to their shock, the Soul Drinkers learned that Rogel Dorn was not in fact their Primarch. The Soul Drinkers chapter name derives from an early mutation to the gene seed of their Omophagia organ. Normally, this organ allows a Space Marine to absorb and experience some of the memories of a creature by consuming its flesh. The Soul Drinkers ritualize this function in the Ceremony of the Chalice. In addition to gaining the consumed creature's memories, the Soul Drinkers could also experience the creature's emotions during the events recorded in their memories as a result of their mutation. Metaphysically speaking, they were able to see into the creature's soul. Chapter Master Sarpedon. Sarpedon was once a librarian of the chapter. He became the chapter master of the Soul Drinkers after killing the former chapter master Gorgolian in single combat, because Gorgolian claimed that the Soul Drinkers were in the wrong since the Imperium had declared them excommunicate traitores. Sarpedon disagreed, and held that the Imperium was corrupt through its actions, not the Soul Drinkers, a position he maintained to the end. Sarpedon was capable of telepathically sending but not receiving thoughts, and was also able to generate a mass psychic illusion called the Hell, which was fed and shaped by the psychological fears of his enemies. His chaos-granted mutation provided him with 8 arachnid limbs, allowing him to scuttle along ceilings and walls, incredible physical strength, and enormously increased his psychic power. Sarpedon defeated such notable foes as the Inquisition's interrogator, Kashuk, his own former chapter master Gorgolian to claim leadership of the Soul Drinkers after they were declared renegades, multiple demons and demon princes, Sergeant Tellos, chapter master Eumenes, and the Necron lord of the tomb world of Salaaka. Sarpedon was most recently defeated in single combat by Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fist's First Company, and finally taken into Imperial custody aboard the Imperial Fist's mobile fortress monastery known as the Phalanx. During his trial, it was revealed to Sarpedon that the famed Soul Drinker philosopher soldier Denyathos, the author of the Catechisms Martial, yet lived, and that he had been interred within the near-indestructible body of a dreadnought millennia before. Sarpedon also learned that the Soul Drinkers chapter was not the genetic successor of the Imperial Fist's Primarch Rogel Dorn. Denyathos then enacted the final phase of his plan and opened a warp gate aboard the Phalanx and summoned forth the demon prince Abraxas. In a final confrontation with Denyathos, Sarpedon was nearly slain but ultimately succeeded in defeating the dreadnought with the artifact known as the Soul Spear. He then dragged the broken body of Denyathos from his cybernetic sarcophagus and carried him through the closing warp gate on the Phalanx, disappearing from the annals of Imperial history. Chapter Master Gorgolion. Gorgolion was the former chapter master of the Soul Drinkers before Sarpedon claimed the office from him. He saw the actions of librarian Sarpedon and his men against the Adeptus Mechanicus, the incident that precipitated the Soul Drinkers' eventual renegade status, as being at fault due to their responsibility for the chapter's excommunication from the Imperium. Sarpedon challenged Gorgolion for the right of leadership of the chapter and its future fate as a renegade chapter. Gorgolion nearly defeated Sarpedon, but the librarian emerged victorious thanks to the timely intervention of the Ruinous Powers, who granted him an arachnoid mutation that imbued him with the power to overcome and kill Gorgolion. With the death of the former chapter master, a civil war was sparked within the ranks of the Soul Drinkers. Most of the chapter's novices and several of the older battle brothers refused to follow their new mutant chapter master Sarpedon and took up arms against their former brethren. It took Sarpedon's forces several months to root them out and exterminate them. Chapter Master Argarath. Argarath was the chapter master of the Soul Drinkers during the Age of Apostasy in the 36th millennium and was present during the Second Siege of the Imperial Palace, where the Soul Drinkers, Black Templars, Imperial Fists, and Firehawks fought to depose the insane High Lord Goga Vandyre. Chaplain Ictinos. The Chaplain. Ictinos was the master of sanctity for the entire chapter. Ictinos clearly had hidden motives and designs upon the Soul Drinkers and manipulated the chapter's course and its eventual damnation and excommunication from the Imperium in accordance with Denyathos's plans to dominate and then mold the galaxy into the image that he foresaw as being beneficial for all mankind. Ictinos met his ultimate fate aboard the Phalanx at the hands of Chapter Master Sarpedon when they fought hand-to-hand. Sarpedon subdued the erstwhile chaplain and then ripped Denyathos's secrets from his mind using his own potent psychic abilities. Ictinos was then blown out of an airlock and into the void of space, a fitting end for the ruination he had brought upon his chapter. Chaplain Apollonios. Apollonios was one of 3 chaplains produced under the tutelage of Reclusiarch Denyathos, that possessed sufficient loyalty and purpose to fulfill the vision that Denyathos had for his chapter. Apollonios had reached the rank of assault captain before he had withdrawn to the Reclusium, seeking greater meaning than could be found executing the emperor's foes at the point of a chainsword. At the time, he was said to be the strongest and most skilled fighter the chapter had seen in a century, and the acclaim such prowess had brought him was all sacrificed when he took up the studies of a chaplain. Chaplain Themiskon. Themiskon was one of 3 chaplains produced under the tutelage of Reclusiarch Denyathos that possessed sufficient loyalty and purpose to fulfill the vision that Denyathos had for his chapter. Themiskon had been considered a talisman of ill fortune. As a novice, 3 masters had been slain while he was in attendance to them. To show that superstition could not be the master of an Astartes, Themiskon was elevated to a battle brother in spite of his ill fortune. When he was the sole survivor of his squad for the second time, he begged for the freedom to do penance for the calamities he was sure he had brought on his battle brothers. The Reclusium took him in, and Denyathos himself turned Themiskon from the harbinger of cruel luck to an icon of redemption, of how even the bleakest fate could not turn an Astartes from the fulfillment of his duties. Themiskon went into battle with his skin pierced by red-hot barbs, the pain reminding him of his past sins and of the pain that would fall on the chapter's enemies in an endless revenge against the universe. Chaplain Aciar. Aciar was one of 3 chaplains produced under the tutelage of Reclusiarch Denyathos that possessed sufficient loyalty and purpose to fulfill the vision that Denyathos had for his chapter. Aciar was a rare thing amongst Astartes, a scholar, a seeker of knowledge. He had served under the Tech Marines and undergone the pilgrimage to Mars, but the mysteries of the chapter's technology had not sated his desire for understanding. Denyathos had entrusted him with the Reclusium's archives, and with collating the many commentaries on the catechisms martial which the soul drinkers had penned in the decades since it had been written. He was as skilled and fierce in battle as any Astartes, but his real value to the chapter was in answering the spiritual questions of the brethren and watching over their minds as the apothecaries watched over their bodies. Aciar had been granted the honor of writing Denyathos's chanson, which would surely serve as an example to every student of the Reclusium to come. Reclusiarch Gorosius. Gorosius was the Reclusiarch and senior chaplain of the Soul Drinkers during the 36th millennium. He wore jet-black power armor with the chapter's colors restricted to 1 shoulder pad. Gorosius was described as possessing skin the color of burnt wood, his eyes small and dark and his jaw full and brutal. A metal panel was set into one side of his forehead and was inscribed with the name of every engagement in which the Reclusiarch had fought. He served as the mentor of the young chaplain aspirant, Denyathos. During his tutelage under Gorosius, Denyathos penned the Catechisms Martial, a superlative work that was the first to successfully capture the spirit of the soul drinkers and put it to parchment. But within its vellum pages, Gorosius discovered hidden messages that the soul drinkers should not obey the will of Terra and should exist outside imperial authority. It would seem becoming renegades would be an inevitable step for the soul drinkers. Denyathos had not anticipated anyone discovering his duplicity so soon. Thus, Denyathos conspired to have the troublesome Reclusiarch killed during an assault on the world of Kal to capture the former imperial missionary Croivus Asanian, now a vile heretic that left misery and death wherever he went. Leaving out vital intelligence, Gorosius was caught in an ambush and was badly wounded. Denyathos then executed his former mentor, murdering him in cold blood. His divine plan for the future of his chapter was now assured. Denyathos was then unanimously elected to become the chapter's new Reclusiarch. Forge Master Arundin, a tech marine who sought to commune with the ancient machine spirit of the scintillating death, to master it and bring its intellect into the Emperor's service. He failed, having died, and the ship with him when it disappeared en route to the Shashina stars in the 34th millennium. Commander Macellus. Macellus was a former commander of the ancient Soul Drinker's ship, the Scintillating Death. During the 34th millennium, he had pledged to rid the Shashina stars of the green-skinned menace, but was lost with all hands before he could reach them, and so the greenskins remained there still. Like his fellow soul drinkers whom had gone down with the ship, Macellus still haunted his former vessel, sitting upon his massive command throne within the ancient command section of the ship. The wide steps leading up to the throne itself were carved with the names of petitioners to the soul drinkers' commanders who had held audience there. The chapter's aspirants of the Reclusium often made pilgrimages to the ancient throne room, seeking audience with the spirit of Macellus, and to learn about the fear that all soul drinkers carried within their souls. Assault Captain Hestius, an assault captain of great renown within the chapter, Hestius had vowed to take 1,000 heads from heretics in revenge for the chapter's grievous losses at Magna Carum. He had taken 809 when he died on the Scintillating Death, when the ship disappeared into the warp in the 34th millennium. Captain Luco commanded one of the Soul Drinkers' battle companies, and was known to utilize a pair of lightning claws in combat. Luco was promoted to the rank of captain following the battle on Intimayan Vapor, and remains one of Sarpedon's most loyal supporters. Luco pretended to love warfare to inspire his followers, but told only Eumenes and Sarpedon the truth of his heart, which was that he actually hated warfare and craved nothing more than peace. Captain Kuhya. Kuhya is a Primaris Marine and the captain of the refounded Soul Drinkers' Third Company during the era Indomitus. He took part in the Indomitus Crusade, and commanded the Third Company when it was deployed to undertake the Keprian reclamation. During the Crusade, the captain led his company as it sought to reclaim the imperial world of Kepris from the chaos cult forces of the arch-heretic Yekikath, the Voice of All. Captain Karaiden, K-I-A. Karaiden wore one of the chapter's few remaining Terminator armor suits. He had a bionic leg and hand to replace those lost in the battle on Stratix Luminae. He was later blasted apart and slain on orders given by Eumenes. Veteran Sergeant Gravis. Gravis was an assault squad sergeant. His mutated right arm allowed him to deftly wield a power axe with one hand. Scout Sergeant Chapter Master Eumenes. Eumenes was the scout sergeant in charge of Nisrius, Scamander, Raek, and other members of a Soul Drinkers scout squad during the hunt for Tellos, the former Soul Drinkers assault sergeant who had been corrupted by Khorne and become a Khornate berserker who had to be slain by the chapter. Eumenes was the Soul Drinker who ultimately found Tellos. Eumenes eventually challenged Sarpedon to a duel over the control and direction of the renegade chapter. Shortly afterwards, he masterminded the rebellion within the Soul Drinkers' ranks that began the Second Chapter War, in which he gained the title of Chapter Master. Eumenes saved Sarpedon's life by killing Lord Librarian Mercano of the Howling Griffins. Sarpedon later killed Eumenes in another duel over control of the chapter. Assault Sergeant Tellos. Once a promising soul drinker, Tellos was corrupted by chaos and became a servant of Khorne. He was an extremely talented close melee combatant like most Khornate berserkers, and he led a group of soul drinkers who turned wholly to the service of the dark gods and had to be hunted down by the rest of the chapter. Sergeant Tellos led his assault squad during the Soul Drinkers' attack on the Van Scorvold Star Fort of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Under Librarian Sarpedon's command, he fought through the Star Fort to retrieve the artifact of the chapter known as the Soul Spear, but it was stolen right in front of Sarpedon by the tech guard of the Mechanicus, which wanted the artifact for itself for study. When the Soul Drinkers attacked the Mechanicus platform to reclaim the artifact from the duplicitous Mechanicus adepts, Tellos was seriously wounded after both his hands were wrenched off at the wrist by an Adeptus Mechanicus electro-priest. His life was saved by the Soul Drinker's apothecary Pallas, who dragged him to safety. Whilst recovering on the Soul Drinker's starship Gundog, Tellos was found to be jamming metal shafts into his amputated stubs and destroying servitors at random in the ship's librarium. This marked the end of Tellos' sanity as a space marine and the beginning of his pronounced mutations as he fell to the chaotic corruption of the blood god. Tellos had the most obvious chaotic mutations in the chapter, second only to those of the chapter master Sarpedon. Refusing to accept any other fate, he always wanted to fight on no matter the odds. He had chain blades grafted into each end of his arms, whilst his accelerated healing mutation held them in place and allowed him to regenerate almost any damage he took instantaneously. His second mutation was a grossly enhanced muscular system and semi-translucent skin. During the time Sarpedon was looking for a cure to halt the chapter's rampant mutations, Tellos disobeyed Sarpedon on numerous occasions. When the cure was finally located, the Soul Drinkers were forced to abandon Tellos and 40 assault marines on Stratix Luminae. They were last seen taking on tens of thousands of mutants and undead creatures from Tetrarak's heretical army. A few years later, Sarpedon received word that Tellos and his assault marines had wiped Stratix Luminae clean of life and had pledged loyalty to Khorne, the chaos god of blood and war. Tellos was eventually tracked to Endymion 4, where he and Sarpedon engaged in a final duel over a bridge. Sarpedon was barely victorious, but during the battle the bridge collapsed, burying him in rubble. As the remaining Soul Drinkers Astartes evacuated Endymion 4, an exterminatus of the planet was ordered by the Inquisition because the world was being overrun by demons and heretics. Tellos survived Sarpedon's assault and sat amidst the ruins of the bridge where he had fought the Soul Drinkers chapter master, as cyclonic torpedoes intended to carry out the exterminatus bored into the surface of Endymion 4 and ignited the world's core. His final thought was, "More blood for the blood god," as the planet broke apart beneath his feet. Sergeant Gavrillion, KIA, Gavrillion had lost half his jaw to shell fragments that left him with scar tissue running from chin to cheek. He later was mutated by the will of Tzeentch. Afterwards, his scar was a bright, livid red, and the old wound had opened up, and from between the folds of rent skin peered a half-dozen eyes. He was killed in the battle against Vemeth. Librarian Terendian. Terendian was a Soul Drinker's librarian. He was able to project powerful lightning attacks from his body by drawing on the power of the Immaterium. Librarian Gresk. Gresk was a Soul Drinker's librarian who possessed the psychic ability to speed up the combat reactions of his battle brothers by enhancing their neurotransmitter functions. Gresk was slain by Eumenes' rebel forces after he warned Sarpedon of an imminent orbital bombardment during the Second Chapter War. Tech Marine Legris. Tech Marine. Legris was the captain of the Broken Back and one of Sarpedon's most favored counselors. Legris was the only chapter member loyal to Sarpedon who remained on the Broken Back during Eumenes' rebellion in the Second Chapter War. Legris sabotaged the starship's Thunderhawks and hid from Eumenes' rebels in the network of maintenance tunnels that catacombed the Broken Back's hull. Legris gave his life to defeat the Necron Lord on Salaaka, after losing his sanity when he joined with a Necron harvester on the world of Ravania. Apothecary Pallas. Pallas was an apothecary of the chapter who developed a way to halt the rampant mutations prevalent amongst the Soul Drinkers following their excommunication from the Imperium. He joined Eumenes' rebel faction in the Second Chapter War because he proclaimed that he could not bear to watch his chapter dwindle and die out in Sarpedon's constant wars. Pallas chose to remain with the chapter in the aftermath of the Second Chapter War to atone for his sins. When they were captured by the Imperial Fists on the world of Salaaka, Along with his fellow battle brothers, he was taken aboard the Phalanx as a captive to await trial and likely execution. When Den-Yathos' treachery was finally revealed, and he summoned a horde of demons aboard the Phalanx, Pallas fought valiantly but was eventually killed. Augustus was an Astartes new to the Soul Drinker's ranks who kept an open mind about the chapter's beliefs. But when he learned about the chapter's conflict with the Howling Griffins, he was deeply reluctant to fight other warriors of the Imperium. After Sarpedon took counsel with him, the new chapter master decided that the Emperor was watching over Augustus. With a name like Augustus, Sarpedon reasoned the young Astartes was clearly someone destined for great things. Machaeras, K-I-A. As a novice, Machaeras served under Commander Chaon, and later performed Chaon's last rites after his death on the Van Scorvold Star Fort. Machaeras was thought killed after Sarpedon cast him out the airlock of the Glory during Sarpedon's rebellion against the Imperium. Instead, he survived and was enhanced with a variety of augmetics. He would serve Inquisitor Thaddeus of the Ordo Hereticus in hunting down his renegade brothers. He was later slain by Sarpedon during the battle on Stratix Luminae. Venerable Dreadnought. Den-Yathos, a revered soul drinker of some renown, Den-Yathos was the former Reclusiarch and later a venerable dreadnought of the chapter. He lived sometime in the 36th millennium, and in his time wrote the Catechisms Martial, which was considered a nearly sacred tome by the soul drinkers, and was still in use during the late 41st millennium by the chapter. Unfortunately, Den-Yathos was also corrupted by chaos in his intense desire to combat the corruption of the Imperium. He concocted a plot to use his own chapter as pawns in a scheme stretching across the millennia with the aid of the demon prince of Tzinch Abraxas. Den-Yathos intended to maneuver his chapter into a position to bring him aboard the Imperial Fist's massive mobile fortress monastery, the Phalanx, and open up an ancient warp gate that secretly existed within the gigantic starship's bowels called the Predator's Eye. Once Abraxas and his demonic horde had seized the vessel from the Imperial Fists, Den-Yathos intended to use the great vessel as his own mobile base to spread the power of chaos across the galaxy and end the Imperium's hypocrisy and corruption. Den-Yathos' mad plan was stopped by the Soul Drinker's chapter master Sarpedon, who learned the truth of Den-Yathos' machinations, defeated the dreadnought in single combat using the artifact called the Soul Spear, and then took Den-Yathos' broken body with him into the Immaterium through the warp gate on the Phalanx to face whatever judgment awaited at the tender mercies of the dark gods.